I call the member for Morani.
My question is to the Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, Minister for Communities and Minister for the Arts. Will the Minister please explain to the House what steps have already commenced to enact the pathway to treaty legislation and what work would be needed to undo this process if the legislation were to be repealed?
I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Morani for his question. I do want to take this moment to acknowledge that he has found a new home with the Katter Australia Party. I do wish him the best in his new endeavours, and I do want to acknowledge the fact that his very first question, since his defection to the Katter Australia Party, is about the path to treaty legislation. So I do want to acknowledge that he is obviously having an influence over the Katter Australia Party in terms of their concern and maybe interest in the path to treaty legislation. I find that really exciting and comforting that there's some sense of maybe looking at the path to treaty legislation as something to be maybe held up. But, Mr Speaker, can I just say that in terms of the path to treaty legislation, there are two main elements to it that have already been enacted. One is the establishment of a truth-telling and healing inquiry. They began their work on the 1st of July. The second is the establishment of a treaty institute. That institute has been appointed and they've been working very hard on the very foundations of establishing that institute. But I do want to remind the member for Morani that, and I imagine that he, just like I imagine, members of the Katter Australia Party are speaking to First Nations leadership across this state. And First Nations leadership across this state is fully supportive of a path to treaty legislation, absolutely fully supportive of a path to treaty legislation, and want to see it enacted in full. And so, but Mr Speaker, of course, that came from a real desire to see the life outcomes, that big gap that we see in life outcomes, closed. Our state, like all other states and territories across this country, are engaged in a national Closing the Gap agreement. That agreement is about closing the gap in life outcomes for First Nations peoples. We saw in this state a need to reframe the relationship to be able to meet our commitments under the Closing the Gap agreement. That reframing relationship began many, many years ago, and through lots of consultation, we got to the point of bringing to this parliament, the 57th parliament, a path to treaty legislation, which was supported, but with bipartisan support, and emphatically supported by the member of Broadwater, the leader of the opposition, who stood in this House and absolutely, in Cairns, and absolutely supported that legislation. And within months, abandoned Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, backflipped, and turned his back on them. Now, this is what we see in the Leader of the Opposition. You cannot trust a single word he says. He could not even run his own business in a way that would be transparent. He is shifty, is dodgy, and that's what we see from him when it comes to path legislation for treaty.
Minister, I've spoken previously about using terms such as dodgy to characterise a member. I ask you to withdraw those.
I withdraw.